Hello everyone, I welcome you all in this course Introduction to Sequence Stratigraphy. So far we have discussed about the basic concepts of sequence stratigraphy, including the idea of how to define the different types of sequence, what are the basic elements of sequence stratigraphy, including different types of surfaces, system strats, and also the concept of parasequence. And all this we have tried to correlate with respect to the shoreline shift, which is commonly controlled by the creation of accommodation, base level change and sediment supply in the marginal marine area of any basin. So, with this basic idea, now we will move on to the further details of different aspects of sequence stratigraphy, and the first part of this discussion we will start with the different types of surfaces. So, from now on, from today's class and next few classes, we will discuss about the detail of different surfaces that we deal in sequence stratigraphy within a sequence model, and we will discuss about how to define those surfaces, what are the different characteristics of those surfaces, how to identify those surfaces, and how they form, in which condition they will form. So, all these aspects we will discuss separately one after another in successive classes. So, in stratigraphy, the bounding surfaces, they are very important, because they always mark a shift through time in the depositional regime. So, for example, when I am talking about the depositional regime, that indicates change in the depositional environment, that indicates change in the sediment load, or that can indicate overall change in the energy flux in the depositional environment. And they are commonly created by the interplay of two major factors, the base level change and the amount of sediments which are coming into the system, which we can call as the sedimentation. So, the interplay of base level change and sedimentation will control what will be the nature of change in terms of depositional regime, and that change in the depositional regime is commonly marked by a bounding surface or demarcated by a surface across which that change is occurring. So, sequence stratigraphic surfaces, or simple the surface, when we are dealing with sequence stratigraphy, the surfaces, they provide the framework for a genetic interpretation of any sedimentary succession, because whenever we are getting a surface, whenever we are trying to identify a surface, that is straightway indicating there is a changeover in terms of process, in terms of conditions. So, that leads us to think about a genetic interpretation of the sedimentary succession, irrespective of whether one have chosen to name the package of strata between them, but always that surface within sequence stratigraphic model will lead to some thinking, some interpretation in terms of a genetic changeover with respect to the depositional condition or depositional environment. So, these surfaces are commonly associated with or commonly identified with respect to change in the condition of shoreline trajectory, because already we know, we have discussed that also in detail, that whenever there is a change in the shoreline trajectory, there will be change in the depositional conditions. Say for example, shoreline is moving from seaward to landward, we will call that one as a transgression. So, when there is a transgression going on, definitely all the depositional conditions and the depositional systems are produced in different zones within that basin. Now, the shoreline trajectory has changed from transgression, it is changing into a regression, a normal regression. So, during the normal regression, the entire depositional systems will try to prograde, and when that progradation is occurring, definitely there will be the change in position of individual sedimentary environments, and due to that change in position of the individual environments, what we will get? We get a surface across which that changeover of depositional environments can be portrayed in terms of the stratal stacking pattern in terms of the depositional systems occurring across that particular surface. So, identifying the stratigraphic surfaces in association with the shoal line trajectory is the core concept, whether we are dealing with sequence stratigraphy or not, but always this surface is defined with respect to the shoal line trajectory, and these are more important than the nomenclature of system strats or even the position of the sequence boundaries, which are model dependent. So, whenever we try to go for sequence stratigraphic model, whenever we try to do some sequence stratigraphic analysis from any sedimentary succession, our first aim is to identify the shoal line trajectories in terms of the stratal stacking pattern, and with respect to that shoal line trajectory, we try to identify the important stratigraphic surfaces. So, across the spectrum of existing sequence stratigraphic models, as per the subject has grown up, it has evolved, the significance of the stratigraphic surfaces may change from sequence boundaries to the system strat boundaries, or even we can move into the system strats, and there we can find out within trained facies contacts. In our previous class, where I introduced you with these different types of surfaces, their names, there I told you there are 7 major surfaces and 3 minor surfaces, which we commonly identify in sequence stratigraphy. So, in sequence stratigraphy, when we try to look into the overall succession and we try to define the different sequence elements, the identification of sequence stratigraphic surfaces that can come up in different orders. So, some of the surfaces are very important surfaces, very prime surfaces, and they may indicate the sequence boundaries. Some of the surfaces, they are not that much prime as sequence boundary, but they are occurring within the sequence and they are indicating the boundaries between system strats. So, they are also very important because they are associated with shoal line trajectories. And when we look into the system strats, there we can get distribution of different depositional systems, and that distribution of one depositional system to another one will be demarcated by change in the facies, and commonly that boundary is identified as another important surface in sequence stratigraphic regime, and that is called as the within trained facies contact, within trained surface. So, in sequence stratigraphy, we identify all these 3 types of boundaries, and based on the type of stratal stacking, the nature of strata associated with that particular surface, we can identify which kind of boundary we are identifying, which kind of boundary that particular surface is indicating, what is the importance of that particular surface. So, broadly we can identify the sequence stratigraphic surfaces into 3 broad categories, commonly identified based on certain criteria. So, those criteria can be applied across all the surfaces. So, what are those criteria? Number 1 is the nature of contact. So, whether we are looking at a conformable contact or we are looking at an unconformable contact. We have discussed about the different types of sequence, and there we have understood how we define a depositional sequence. So, a depositional sequence indicates the package deposited within one unconformity at the bottom to the next unconformity at the top. So, definitely the surface defining or bounding that package for a depositional sequence should be an unconformable contact. Whereas, when we look at a correlative conformity surface, a correlative conformity surface which is forming at the same time with an unconformity in the deeper part of the basin. As the name is suggesting, the correlative conformity surface, it should be a conformable surface, because in the deeper marine part, even during the falling stage, even during the forced regression, there is a continuous sedimentation going on. There is no break in sedimentation, there is no erosion is going on. So, what is the nature of contact? That is very important. That is the first criteria that gives us idea, that gives us clue to identify a particular surface in sequence stratigraphic model. Second, what are the facies types occurring in contact across the surface? So, if this is the surface, then what kind of facies are lying below, what kind of facies are lying above across that particular surface? Because when we are looking into the facies, particularly when we are looking at the 3D assemblage of the facies, that is giving us idea about the depositional systems. So, what is the distribution of different depositional systems across that particular surface, underlying and overlying, that is very important. So, the nature of facies in contact across the surface is very important. Third one, again a very important point, the depositional trend below and above the contact. What is the meaning of that? If this is the surface, what is the depositional trend? That means whether this is a retrogradational, this is a fining up, whether this is a progradational, coarsening up. So, we can get progradational pattern, aggradational pattern, retrogradational pattern. So, what kind of depositional trend we are getting? We can get aggradational associated with progradational. So, across one contact, one surface, what is the nature of depositional trend? That is very crucial point, very crucial criteria to identify a sequence stratigraphic surface. Along with these three, the first three, which are the basic fundamental points that we have to keep in our mind, along with that we can use few more criteria depending on section to section, area to area, preservation potential. So, one of them is the ichnological characteristics, because across the surfaces when we are getting a change in facies, when you are getting a change in the depositional trend, when you are expecting a change in the shoreline trajectory, that often leads to characteristic change in the ichnological assemblages in terms of ichnofabric, in terms of ichnofacies across the particular surface. So, many times occurrence of a particular ichnofacies is very much characteristic to identify a particular surface. In our class on parasequence, I give you one example about the formation of firm ground and occurrence of glossy fungites ichnofacies across the marine flooding surface. So, that is one example. Many a times across the erosional surfaces, across the correlative conformity surfaces, across the maximum flooding surfaces MFS, we get very characteristic ichno assemblages, very characteristic ichnofacies types, which can help us in identifying a particular surface or a particular system strat boundary. Apart from this, another very important parameter is the nature of stratal terminations. So, how the stratal packages are terminating against that particular surface. So, whether there is a downlap surface, whether there is an onlap surface, whether it is an offlap surface or it is an toplap or truncation surface, because already we have discussed about that, the termination of the stratal packages across a particular surface is very often characteristic of a particular event associated with a phase of shoreline trajectory. Onlap, that kind of succession, that kind of termination is often associated with transgression, whereas offlap is often associated with forced regression. So, if we are getting that kind of stratal terminations, that can be very much indicative, very much helpful in identifying a stratigraphic surface. So, these are some of the broad criteria, very basic fundamental criteria that we have to keep in our mind. We have to look for these parameters, these characteristics when we try to identify a stratigraphic surface. So, the nature of contact, the nature of facies occurrences, the depositional trend, ichnological characteristic if ichnoforms are present, and stratal termination pattern. So, most of these criteria they involve preliminary facies analysis. That is why I told you at the very beginning of this course that phases analysis is a very basic concept in sequence stratigraphy, because everything, all these interpretations, identifications are relying on a proper phases analysis. And what we require is a very clear understanding of the environments in which the stratigraphic contact and the associated phases types are formed, they have been originated. So, understanding of depositional environments, understanding of the phases models of individual environments and phases analysis, these are the fundamental key, fundamental tool for identification of surfaces in sequence stratigraphy. The reconstruction of the depositional setting often enables us to interpret or to apply the objective criteria for the recognition, correlation and mapping of the stratigraphic surfaces. So, depending on the type of data available for analysis, some contacts can appear in terms of separate packages of strata, and those strata are occurring in different arrangements across the surface. So, it can be contrasting stacking patterns across the surface, which can be mapped solely on the basis of how stratal packages are occurring across the surface, and many times how the stratal packages are terminating against that particular surface. So, that termination pattern can be mapped, that stratal stacking pattern can be mapped, and when we map that across the basin, we can identify distinct surfaces. So, that kind of mapping, that kind of correlations can be independent of the other constants, like we do not have to think of the paleodepositional environment. Just say for example, from seismic profile or maybe just from well log data, we are trying to correlate from well log data, or we are just looking at a seismic profile and we are not trying to interpret about the paleodepositional environment. Just we can look at how the stratal stacking patterns are there and how they are terminating, and based on that, in terms of change in the stratal stacking pattern and in terms of the termination pattern, we can straightway identify, yes, there is a surface. This surface is very important, as across that surface we are getting a change in the stratal termination pattern or stratal stacking pattern. So, very often we can do that using seismic profiles, which are available for the preliminary screening of subsurface stratigraphy. So, when we are looking at such seismic profiles, straightway we can interpret or identify truncation surfaces, we can identify top lap surfaces, on lap surfaces, on lapping patterns, we can identify the off laps, we can identify the down lap surfaces and the down lapping clinoforms. They can be very easily identified in various scales, simply based on the kind of geometric relationship of the underlying and the overlying strata across that particular contact. So, integration of additional data within the seismic profiles, say for example, well log data, say for example, core sample data, for example, outcrop data, that can provide us further additional constraints, further additional understandings about the depositional setting, about the distribution of the depositional systems, and using them we can interpret about how these stratal terminations have formed, what is the significance of these stratal terminations, and we can interpret about the genesis of the stratal stacking pattern and the stratal terminations in an environmental context. So, when we try to interpret them with respect to this environmental context, that allow us for a proper identification of the stratigraphic contact in a sequence stratigraphic regime, within a sequence stratigraphic paradigm. So, when we try to interpret a stratigraphic surface, or when we are trying to identify stratigraphic surfaces, we can do that in different ways. So, based on that approach, based on that concept of different types of stratigraphic surfaces, we can classify them into three broad categories, as I told you earlier. The first one, it is called as the environment dependent surface. environment dependent surface. So, these surfaces they have specific environment of origin. That means, we will identify them in specific environment and they will be characterized by specific occurrences of particular depositional systems underlying and overlying. So, we commonly identify them within a specific stratigraphic context. For example, surface of fluvial incision. We cannot expect a fluvial incision in deeper marine part. It will be always only in that part where the fluvial system is getting affected by base level change, base level fall, and there straightway the fluvial incision will be produced as a separate surface commonly associated with unconformity. Similarly, a transgressive wave scouring. So, definitely we will get this kind of surface, commonly a ravinement surface, wave ravinement surface that forms during transgression. We cannot expect that particular surface to form in the deeper marine part, because there it is beyond the wave base, it is below the wave base where the effect of wave is not visible, it is not possible. So, we can get this transgressive wave scouring only when we are looking above the wave base. So, it will be very shallow water only within the marginal marine part, very shallow marine part, maybe going into little bit of within the estuarine system. But if we go into the continental part, wave activity will not be possible over there. So, we cannot expect formation of a wave scouring surface during transgression to form in the continental setup. Same with the regressive wave scouring surface. So, there can be several such surfaces. These are some of the examples which are environment dependent surfaces. So, the second type of surface is called as a geometric surface. So, these are independent of the environmental condition, independent of the environmental interpretations, depositional systems. To identify this kind of surfaces, we solely depend on the stacking pattern of the strata and how those stratal stacking patterns are terminating against a particular surface. For example, on-lap surface, down-lap surface, truncation, off-lap surface, all these are geometric surfaces. And the third one is a conceptual surface. So, in this case, we are looking or interpreting a surface with respect to its occurrence, its position in the context of sequence stratigraphic model. So, in this case, we are trying to identify a surface with respect to the stratal packages and we are interpreting them with respect to the depositional systems. We are also looking at what are the nature of stratal stacking pattern with respect to the shoreline trajectory. So, we are trying to identify them in terms of the system strat or the overall sequence, and accordingly we are defining that particular contact. So, these conceptual surfaces, for example, maximum flooding surface, for example, maximum regressive surface, for example, BSFR, basal surface of forced regression, subaerial unconformity, correlative conformity. So, these surfaces are conceptual surfaces, they are not actually occurring. So, for example, correlative conformity, this surface is not occurring actually, we are identifying that within a conformable succession with respect to our interpretation of the depositional environment, of the depositional conditions changing with respect to the forced regressive condition. We are trying to identify a surface which is demarcating the end of forced regression in the deeper marine part. So, it is entirely conceptual. So, this kind of surfaces are called conceptual surfaces. In sequence stratigraphy, we apply all these three types of surfaces together. We try to identify the surfaces in terms of their geometry, we try to identify the surfaces in terms of their occurrences in particular depositional environments, and then we apply our concept, then we apply our understanding about the depositional environments, about the overall distribution of different depositional environments with respect to shoreline trajectories, and then we identify the surfaces which are conceptual surfaces. Some of them may be a system stack boundary, some of them may be sequence boundary. So, in that way we define major surfaces within the sequence stratigraphic model, within the sequence stratigraphic paradigm. So, sequence stratigraphic surfaces are used to build the chronostratigraphic framework of a sedimentary succession. So, always we try to relate them in terms of some time frame within a chronostratigraphic framework, from the scale of individual depositional system to the entire basin fill succession. So, we can assign different hierarchic terms starting from 5th order, 4th order, 3rd order, 2nd order, like this it can go on. This already we have discussed in our class on this concept of scale in sequence stratigraphy, and there we have understood that how we can apply this concept of sequence stratigraphy, different elements of sequence stratigraphy in different scales, starting from depositional system to the entire basin fill succession. So, once this sequence stratigraphic framework is established, that means when we have identified the major surfaces, and within that major surfaces we are identifying the packages in between those surfaces, and we are trying to identify the packages in terms of system strat with respect to shoreline trajectory. So, sequence boundaries followed by system strat boundaries and the system strats. Then we can look for additional surfaces which may be traced within the genetically interpreted units, genetically similar units. Say for example, we are looking within a system strat now, and within that system strat, as per definition of the system strat, these are the assemblage of several depositional systems during a particular phase of shoreline shift. So, now we can look into individual depositional systems and we can identify what is the nature of contact between these depositional systems. Say for example, when a transgressive system strat is forming, within that transgressive system strat we will get a fluvial depositional system, we can get an estuarine depositional system, we can get a shallow marine or maybe a shore depositional system, we can get a self depositional system. So, what is the nature of contact between the estuary depositional system and the shore depositional system? That can be identified as the facies boundary, the boundary between the facies associations, and that can also be identified within the sequence stratigraphic surface, and we identify them as the within trained facies contact, the minor surfaces, but we identify them on later phase. So, when we work in sequence stratigraphic paradigm, sequence stratigraphic model, there our first aim is to identify the major surfaces. So, major surfaces are commonly identified in terms of their geometry. Then we apply the concept of depositional environments, concept of facies analysis. We look into the shoreline trajectory system and we try to identify further minor surfaces which are commonly the system strat boundaries within those major sequence. And within the system strat we can further go into interpretations and we can look for the within trained facies contact. As we have already discussed that the sequence stratigraphic elements, that means the surfaces and the system strats, they are commonly defined with respect to two basic curves. One describing the base level change at the shoreline, and the second one describing the associated shoreline shift indicating the transgressive regressive curve. So, based on these two curves, they are not exactly juxtaposed on one another, they are little bit offset with respect to each other, and they are commonly offset by a duration of normal regression whose timing is controlled by the interplay of base level and sedimentation at the shoreline. So, this part we have already discussed in detail. So, I will not go into that detail part again. I will just refer back to this fundamental diagram. This diagram I have already shown you earlier also. This is a very fundamental diagram, and again we are referring back to this particular diagram because this is the key to understand the basic sequence elements. So, in this diagram what we can see over here, this red line is the base level curve, this blue dashed line is the TR curve, this is the base level curve and this is the TR curve. So, we are getting transgression and regression, in this way it is going on. So, this is the reference line, the time frame. So, across this reference line for some time we are getting peak of the transgression, here also we are getting peak of transgression, here also peak of transgression. We are getting peak of regression if you follow the blue dashed line, and accordingly we are getting this kind of transgressive phases and normal regressive and forced regressive phases. So, based on this diagram and based on this interrelationship of the base level curve and the sedimentation, we can identify several systems tracts. We can identify 4 events, 4 major events, and those 4 major events leads to identification of the major boundaries. So, the first one is the end of transgression and start of regression. We identify that as the maximum flooding surface. The second major event is the start of or onset of the forced regression, end of the normal regression. We identify that one as the BSFR, basal surface of forced regression. Then comes the end of the forced regression, which is identified by correlative conformity in the marine part, in the basinal part, or an unconformity in the marginal marine part or in the fluvial part. Then we get end of the regression and start of the transgression. So, it is maximum regressive surface. So, these are the major surfaces: maximum flooding surface, basal surface of forced regression, correlative conformity and unconformity, maximum regressive surface. And along with this we get another surface which may form during this falling stage, which is called as RSME, regressive surface of marine erosion. So, these surfaces which are binding different systems tracts, they always come up with some special characteristics, some distinct characteristics, which we can use for identification in the rock record. So, what are those basic criteria? What are those basic identifying features? We will discuss about them in detail. We will pick up individual surfaces one by one and we will discuss them in detail in next few classes. But if I just want to summarize that how we can identify them, what are the basic criteria? Say for example, if I talk about the subaerial unconformity. The subaerial unconformity, as we know that if I look at the nature of surface, so it is an unconformable surface. So, this is the nature of surface, unconformable. This is an unconformable surface. So, what will be the type of succession, the depositional trend? Below the subaerial unconformity, what is occurring? It is an HST. So, over there in the lower part of the succession below the subaerial unconformity, we expect an HST to occur. So, it should be a normal regressive pattern, and when it is a normal regressive, it should be a coarsening upward pattern. Sometime if the subaerial unconformity is very prominent and it is leading to intense weathering, intense erosion, in those cases it can lead to the transgressive part, the TST package as well. So, in case of subaerial unconformity, the underlying systems tract is expected to be HST, but in some cases it can lead to the TST, and if it is a TST, in that case it will be a fining upward succession below the subaerial unconformity. What will be overlying the subaerial unconformity? On the subaerial unconformity, what we expect is LST to occur. So, that LST will be commonly associated with a normal regression, and normal regression means it should be a coarsening upward succession. So, subaerial unconformity, it is an unconformable contact and associated with this kind of packages overlying and underlying. Now, if I compare this with a correlative conformity surface, what will be the nature over here? First of all, this surface is a conformable contact. Is a conformable contact. So, correlative conformity, it is forming in the deeper part of the basin, erosion is not associated with it. So, we can expect a very clear cut HST to be formed over there just below this, and this HST will be followed by FSST, the falling stage systems tract. So, definitely during this interphase, what we are getting? a normal regression or a forced regression. So, commonly it will be associated with a forced regression, and that forced regression will produce this kind of coarsening upward succession. So, again we will get a coarsening upward depositional pattern, depositional trend. On the correlative conformity, above the correlative conformity, what we expect? LST, the low stand systems tract, and this is a normal regressive part, normal regressive package, and it will be associated with again a coarsening upward succession, coarsening upward depositional trend. So, correlative conformity is not associated with much change in terms of depositional pattern or depositional trend, and that is why it is very difficult to identify. There will be minor change in terms of the depositional condition, depositional environment and the resultant phases. So, there will be minor change in terms of the phases pattern, but not much change in terms of the overall depositional trend. In contrast to that, if I look at the maximum flooding surface, refer back to that previous diagram. So, maximum flooding surface is the bounding surface at the end of transgressive systems tract. So, it is not associated with any kind of erosion. So, normally maximum flooding surface is a conformable surface. Very rarely we can get some erosion across maximum flooding surface. Normally it is a conformable surface, and when maximum flooding surface is reached, water level is very high, it is the peak of transgression. So, it is commonly associated with very fine grained sediments. Very fine grained sedimentation. So, this maximum flooding surface is underlain by a TST, transgressive systems tract. We all know that transgressive systems tract is associated with fining upward depositional trend. It is a retrogradational pattern, it is a transgression. So, very clearly we get this kind of fining upward trend over there, just below the maximum flooding surface. Above the maximum flooding surface, what we expect? HST, high stand systems tract. HST, there we get progradation associated with aggradation. So, again we get this kind of succession. So, this is the MFS. So, we get a very distinct changeover in terms of depositional trend. So, fining upward changing over into coarsening upward, retrogradational changing up into progradational or aggradational, TST overlain by HST. So, very clearly we can identify that. Similarly, if I look at the MRS, maximum regressive surface, just the reverse of this. Again this is a conformable surface, deposition is going on continuously over here. However, the phases type may vary, because from area to area there we can get different types of phases, different type of depositional systems. And across this surface, below the maximum regressive surface, what we get? We get the LST package. So, low stand systems tract, this is a normal regression again. So, it will be a coarsening upward trend, whereas the overlying unit is a transgressive unit, TST. So, it will be a fining upward, a transgressive unit. So, in this case a coarsening upward depositional trend will be overlain by a fining upward depositional trend. So, we get a changeover. Similarly, if I look at the BSFR, basal surface of forced regression, so this can be associated with some conformable contact normally, sometimes it can be associated with some erosions. Below BSFR we get HST, above BSFR we get the forced regressive package, that is the falling stage systems tract. So, there again we will get the association of coarsening upward followed by another coarsening upward, and sometimes that upper coarsening upward, which is part of the falling stage systems tract, it can be associated with some truncation surfaces at the top or maybe some offlapping surfaces at the top. So, again a coarsening upward to coarsening upward changeover. So, from this summary, from this overview, we can get an idea that each of these surfaces, they come up with some distinct criteria, some distinct properties in terms of their geometry, in terms of the stratal stacking pattern, in terms of the stratal termination pattern, and in terms of the depositional environments and depositional systems occurring across that particular surface. So, in next few classes we will discuss about these parameters in detail, taking each and every surfaces which are important in sequence stratigraphy, and we will try to understand that what are the criteria, how they differ from one surface to another. So, these are some of the references that you can follow for further reading on this particular topic. Thank you everyone.